A black waitress paid for a homeless veteran's meal. The next day, a military convoy showed up. The diner was quiet, the kind of slow night where the ticking of the clock seemed louder than the conversations. Danielle Walker, a hard-working black waitress, moved behind the counter, wiping down surfaces for the third time in 10 minutes. She glanced at the flickering neon sign outside, reflecting off the window. Tony's Diner had been her life for the past 2 years, a place where she had memorized every regular's order, where the scent of fresh coffee clung to her apron long after her shift ended. But tonight, the quiet was suffocating. Danielle's rent was due next week, and her tips had barely covered groceries. Business had been slow. That meant fewer customers, fewer tables to turn over, and even fewer dollars slipped into her pockets at the end of the night. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up. A man stood in the entrance, hesitant, as if debating whether to step inside at all. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed and covered in dust, and his jacket hung loosely over his thin frame. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen better days but refused to be broken by the worst ones. Danielle immediately noticed the way his fingers clutched a few crumpled bills, his knuckles turning white, as if calculating exactly how much he could afford. He stepped forward cautiously, clearing his throat. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice rough but polite. "What can I get for $5? Danielle glanced at the menu board. The cheapest item was a cup of coffee and toast, barely enough for someone who looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in days. She studied his face, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he carried himself like someone who had been through more than most could imagine. Her heart clenched. "You're in luck," she said, offering a warm smile. "We've got a special tonight, 1 full meal for $5. The man blinked, his lips parting slightly as if unsure he had heard her correctly. "Really?" "Really," Danielle said, already keying in the order before he could argue. She turned to the kitchen and paid for the meal herself, slipping a worn $20 bill from her apron pocket. She didn't have much, but she knew what it felt like to struggle, to wonder if tomorrow's paycheck would be enough. A few minutes later, she placed a steaming plate of food in front of him, a burger, fries, and a hot cup of coffee. The man stared at the meal, then at her. His throat bobbed, and for a moment, Danielle thought he might refuse out of pride. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured, his voice softer now. Danielle shrugged. "Everyone deserves a warm meal." A small, grateful smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He picked up his fork, but before he could take a bite, a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Danielle, a word now." She turned, heart pounding, as Jake Holden, the diner's manager, stormed toward her, his expression tight with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped. Danielle's stomach nodded, but she stood her ground. "I paid for it myself." Jake scoffed, his arms crossing. "We're not a charity. If you want to feed bums, do it somewhere else." Danielle's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "He's a veteran." Jake rolled his eyes, unimpressed. "Not my problem." Then, to the horror of everyone watching, he grabbed the plate off the counter and threw it into the trash. The diner went silent. Danielle froze, staring at the wasted food, the smell of fresh fries and warm beef suddenly sickening in her nostrils. The veteran remained still, his hands resting on the table, his face unreadable. But Danielle saw the flicker of something painful in his eyes, something too familiar. Her chest tightened. She turned back to Jake, her voice low but laced with steel. "You're a disgrace." Jake smirked, unfazed. "And you're unemployed." For a moment, Danielle thought she had misheard him. But then she saw the way he stood, arms crossed, smirk widening, waiting for her to react. "You're firing me?" she asked, her voice steady, though her fingers trembled at her sides. Jake nodded. "That's right. Grab your things and get out." Danielle scanned the room, hoping for anyone to speak up. But the other employees kept their heads down, too afraid to get involved. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves, but no one dared to challenge Jake. The veteran slowly stood, his movements careful, controlled. His gaze locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, Danielle thought he might say something, might defend her. But instead, he simply nodded. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice steady. Jake snorted, flicking a dismissive glance at him. "I don't owe you anything, old man." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Danielle swallowed hard, her throat burning. The veteran turned to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name: gratitude, maybe, or quiet understanding. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. Danielle forced a small smile, though her stomach twisted with uncertainty. "I wish I could have done more." The man shook his head, offering the smallest of smiles. "You already did more than most." Then, with the same dignity he had walked in with, he picked up his hat, tucked it under his arm, and walked out into the cold night. Danielle watched him go, her heart aching. She turned back to Jake, anger boiling beneath the surface. "You're going to regret this." Jake let out a dry laugh. "Doubt it." Danielle grabbed her coat and walked out, stepping into the icy wind. Her mind spun, the weight of what had just happened pressing heavily on her chest. She had lost her job, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had done something right. It felt unfair. It was unfair. She had no job, no backup plan, no idea what to do next. And yet, what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that within 24 hours, everything would change. Danielle Walker stepped out of Tony's diner, her breath visible in the cold night air. The neon sign buzzed softly behind her, casting a dull glow on the damp sidewalk. Just hours ago, she had walked into her shift with a job, with purpose. Now, she was leaving with nothing. Her mind raced as she walked home. Jake's words replayed over and over in her head. "You're unemployed. We're not a charity. If you want to feed bums, do it somewhere else." The anger in her chest burned hot, but beneath it, fear curled around her ribcage like a vice. What was she going to do now? She had rent due in a week. Her savings barely covered groceries. She had no safety net, no backup plan, no one to call for help. Danielle pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, shivering not from the cold, but from uncertainty. As she walked, she passed familiar storefronts and late-night convenience stores, their windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Inside, people laughed, shopped, lived their lives as if the world hadn't just crumbled beneath her feet. By the time she reached her tiny apartment, her hands were numb, her legs sore, and her heart felt heavier than ever. She unlocked the door, stepping inside to silence. The room was small, just a bed, a table, and a tiny kitchenette. But tonight, it felt even emptier than usual. She tossed her coat over the chair and sank onto the bed. Her eyes landed on a small stack of unpaid bills sitting on the table, a final notice stamped in red across one of the envelopes. Danielle's chest tightened. She leaned forward, pressing her elbows to her knees, her hands clenching into fists. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been through worse. She had survived before, and she would survive this too. But as the hours stretched on and sleep refused to come, the doubt crept in like a shadow, whispering that maybe, just maybe, Jake had been right. Maybe no one cared. Maybe she really was disposable. Maybe doing the right thing wasn't worth it. The next morning, Danielle Walker woke up to a reality she had been trying to ignore. Sunlight spilled weakly through her apartment window, casting long shadows over the bills stacked on her table, the unopened final notice that she didn't have the courage to read last night. She sat up, her body aching from tension and exhaustion. Her mind screamed at her to do something, to fix this, but where could she even start? She had spent the last 2 years depending on Tony's diner, making just enough to stay afloat. Now that lifeline was gone. But she wasn't going to sit around and feel sorry for herself. She showered quickly, threw on her warmest coat, and headed out the door, determined to find a new job before her rent was due. By mid-morning, Danielle had walked through almost every restaurant, cafe, and shop in town, filling out one job application after another. "We're not hiring right now." "We'll keep your resume on file," Sorry, we just filled that position. Over and over, the same tired rejections. By noon, her feet ached, her fingers stiff from the cold, and her hope was running dangerously low. She knew finding a job wouldn't be easy, but she had at least expected a chance. Instead, it felt like every door was shutting in her face. And that feeling, the feeling of being invisible, being disposable, was worse than getting fired. She found herself walking back toward Tony's diner, not because she planned to go inside, but because her feet carried her there anyway. Across the street, she saw Jake laughing with another employee, acting as if nothing had happened, as if she had never even existed. Her stomach tightened, anger bubbling beneath the exhaustion. Then something shifted. A low, deep rumbling filled the air, vibrating through the pavement beneath her feet. Danielle frowned, turning toward the sound. It was louder than traffic, heavier than a passing truck. Then she saw them. A military convoy jeeps, armored vehicles, and a long line of uniformed Marines marching in perfect formation was rolling down the street, heading straight for the diner. The sight stopped people in their tracks. Pedestrians turned their heads, store owners stepped out onto sidewalks, cashiers paused mid-scan. This town wasn't exactly used to seeing dozens of Marines moving with precision down the main road. Danielle felt her pulse quicken. Something was happening. And for some reason, it was happening right in front of Tony's diner. She watched in disbelief as the convoy slowed to a stop, right outside the place where she had been fired less than 24 hours ago. Then, the doors of the lead vehicle swung open, and a tall, decorated Marine officer stepped out, adjusting his uniform as he surveyed the diner. A hush fell over the town. Danielle felt her breath catch. Jake, who had been in the middle of wiping down the counter, froze mid-motion as the bell above the diner door jingled. He looked up, expecting another customer. Instead, Colonel James Carter walked in. Behind him, a dozen Marines followed, their boots striking the diner floor in perfect unison. Every conversation in the diner died instantly. Jake blinked, clearly thrown off by the presence of so many high-ranking military personnel standing in his diner. Can I help you?" he asked, forcing a nervous chuckle. The colonel's sharp gaze locked onto him. "We're looking for Danielle Walker." The room went still. Jake hesitated. She doesn't work here anymore." The colonel didn't blink. "We know." Before Jake could even begin to process what was happening, the diner door swung open again, and another figure stepped inside. William Adler. Danielle felt the air leave her lungs. But he wasn't the same tired man who had walked into the diner yesterday, clutching crumpled bills and quiet dignity. Today he stood proud, strong, dressed in full Marine dress uniform, ribbons and medals neatly displayed on his chest. Jake's face strained of color. "William?" William didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he turned to the colonel beside him and gave a small nod. "This is Colonel James Carter," William said, his voice steady, unshaken. "And these men? They're my brothers." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The colonel took a step forward, his presence towering over Jake. "William Adler isn't just any veteran," Carter said, his voice measured but sharp. "He's a decorated war hero. He saved dozens of Marines in combat, and last night he was treated here like he was worthless." Jake's face turned a shade paler, his lips parting as if to protest. "We came here," the colonel continued, his voice like steel, "because someone in this town, the only person in this town, recognized his worth." The colonel's gaze flickered to the window, landing directly on Danielle. Her stomach flipped. "We came here for her," he said, his voice strong, unwavering. The entire diner turned to look outside, where Danielle stood frozen on the sidewalk, heart racing. Jake's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't know," he started, his voice weak. "You didn't care," William cut in. And that somehow was worse. Danielle could barely breathe. Then the colonel's voice rang out again, clear as day. "Miss Walker," he called, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear, "are you ready for a new beginning?" Danielle Walker stood frozen outside Tony's diner, the place where she had been humiliated just one night ago. Yesterday, she had been thrown away like she didn't matter. Today, an entire military convoy had arrived for her. The morning air was crisp, but she barely noticed the chill against her skin. All she could hear was Colonel Carter's voice echoing through the diner. "Miss Walker, are you ready for a new beginning?" For a moment, she couldn't move. The world around her seemed to slow as she tried to process what was happening. Inside the diner, Jake Holden stood frozen behind the counter, his hands gripping the rag he had been using to clean the register. Gone was the smug expression from the night before. His face had lost all color, his eyes darting between the Colonel, William, and the Marines standing like an immovable wall before him. The customers, the same people who had stayed silent when she was fired, were now watching with wide eyes, murmuring to one another. This time, no one was looking away. Danielle forced herself to breathe, her heart hammering in her chest. She had spent the past 24 hours feeling invisible, discarded. And yet here they were. For her. She took a slow step forward, then another. With every step toward the diner's entrance, her back straightened, her chin lifted higher. By the time she reached the doorway, the Colonel was waiting for her. Jake cleared his throat loudly, finally snapping out of his stunned silence. "Danielle, look," he started, his voice shaky but desperate. "Maybe we were a little hasty yesterday. If you want your job back, we can—" "No," Danielle cut him off before he could finish. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, unshakable. Jake flinched slightly, as if he had expected her to beg. She lifted her chin. "You made it clear what kind of person you are." She took a slow breath, letting her words hang in the air for everyone to hear. "And I don't work for people like you." Jake's jaw clenched, but for once, he had nothing to say. The Colonel smirked slightly, turning his attention back to Danielle. "You made a choice last night," Carter said, "to stand up for someone when no one else would." Danielle swallowed hard, her fingers clenching at her sides. "And it cost me everything." "No," the Colonel corrected, shaking his head. "It gave you something greater." Danielle hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her chest. "What kind of job is this?" she finally asked. William stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his medals glinting under the diner's fluorescent lights. "You'd be working with veterans," he said, "people like me." "We run a transition program," Carter explained. "We help vets find housing, jobs, therapy. We connect them to resources that can actually change their lives." He studied her carefully. "It's not easy work, but it's meaningful." Danielle bit the inside of her cheek, a lifetime of doubt whispering in the back of her mind. "You don't have experience. You don't have the qualifications. You're just a waitress." But then William spoke again. "You already did the job last night," he said, his voice quieter but just as strong. "You treated me with respect, like I mattered." Danielle looked at him, really looked at him. The man she had met the night before wasn't the man standing in front of her now. That was because of her. Because she had done something that mattered. A lump formed in her throat. She took a deep, shaky breath before looking back at Colonel Carter. "What happens if I say yes?" The Colonel's expression softened slightly. "Then you get a fresh start," he said simply. Danielle exhaled slowly, the weight of her past fears and doubts loosening their grip on her shoulders. For so long she had felt like she had no options, no control over her life. But now she had a choice. And she wasn't about to let it pass her by. She lifted her chin. "Okay," she said, "I'm in." A wave of relief washed over her as soon as she spoke the words. The Colonel smiled. "Welcome aboard." Danielle reached out and shook his hand, feeling a certainty she hadn't felt in years. Behind her, a cheer erupted. William clapped her on the back, his smile wide. The Marines behind them nodded in approval. Even some of the customers who had stayed silent before now clapped, murmuring among themselves about how Jake had just lost more than an employee. He had lost his dignity. Jake stood behind the counter, humiliated, furious, and powerless. Danielle didn't spare him another glance. She had bigger things ahead. As she stepped outside into the fresh air, she realized something. She had spent years working for people who never truly valued her. She had accepted poor treatment because she thought it was the only way to survive. But she had been wrong. She had stood up for someone when it mattered. And now people were standing up for her. As she reached the waiting convoy, she let out a slow breath, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. William fell and stepped beside her. "You ever thought about working with veterans?" She glanced at him, then at the Marines who'd come here for her, at the respect in their eyes, the sense of belonging she had never felt before. "No," she admitted, "but I think I'd be good at it." William smiled. "I know you would." Danielle looked ahead as they approached the Veteran Transition Center vehicle, the place where she would soon start a new chapter. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. 1 year later, Danielle Walker stood in a very different place than she had been just 12 months ago. Gone were the long, exhausting shifts at Tony's diner, the constant anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, the feeling of being undervalued and invisible. Now, she stood at the Veteran Transition Center, a place she had never known existed before that fateful day, a place she now called home. The center was bustling with activity, a space filled with veterans finding second chances, rebuilding their lives, reconnecting with the world they once served. Danielle had helped make that happen. She had spent the past year learning, adapting, and growing, not just in her job, but in herself. She had gone from being a waitress who defended one veteran to being an advocate for thousands. And today was a big day. The Veteran Integration Conference was being held at the center, bringing together veterans, employers, community leaders, and military officials to discuss job opportunities, mental health resources, and ways to make the transition back into civilian life easier. It was the biggest event she had ever helped organize. And as she stood near the entrance, watching the hallways buzz with people shaking hands, connecting, sharing stories, she felt something deep inside her chest pride. She had built something real here. "You look nervous?" Danielle turned and saw William Adler standing beside her, dressed in a neatly pressed polo with the center's logo on it. She smirked. "That obvious?" William chuckled. "A little?" He nodded toward the main hall. "You pulled this whole thing together, Danielle. It's going to be great." Danielle exhaled slowly. She wanted to believe that. She had never planned on working at a veterans center. She had never imagined standing in front of military leaders, community organizers, and business executives, explaining why hiring veterans wasn't charity. It was a responsibility. And yet here she was, because of one act of kindness, one moment of standing up for what was right. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter and voices from across the room. She turned and spotted a group of veterans huddled around a table, deep in conversation with local employers. One of them was a young man, barely in his mid-20s, shifting nervously as he filled out an application. His hands trembled slightly, his eyes darting between the papers and the employer in front of him. Danielle recognized that look. She had seen it on William's face a year ago. She had felt it herself the day she was fired. That fear of being overlooked, of being seen as nothing more than a burden, of not knowing if you belonged anywhere at all. Danielle didn't hesitate. She crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, "you're in the right place." The young man looked up at her, startled, but there was relief in his eyes. Danielle gave him a reassuring smile, the same way she had smiled at William that night in the diner. A simple gesture. But sometimes that was all it took to change a life. The conference was in full swing, and Danielle Walker watched as veterans filled the event hall, shaking hands with business owners, signing up for job opportunities, and speaking with mental health professionals who were there to help them transition into civilian life. A year ago, she had never imagined herself in a place like this. She had been a waitress at a small-town diner, just trying to get by, never thinking she would end up playing a role in changing people's lives. And yet here she was. "Are you ready?" Danielle turned to see Colonel James Carter standing beside her, his sharp gaze softened with familiarity. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Ready is a strong word." He smirked. "You've been doing the work for a year, Danielle. You're more than ready." She nodded slowly, rolling her shoulders as if loosening the tension that had been building all morning. Today, she wasn't just running logistics or guiding veterans through job applications. Today, she was the keynote speaker. A year ago, she had been fired in front of a room full of people. Today, she was about to stand on a stage in front of an even bigger crowd this time to tell her story on her own terms. The lights in the conference hall dimmed slightly as the announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "And now we'd like to introduce someone who knows firsthand what it means to fight for those who fought for us." Danielle felt her heartbeat thunder in her ears as she took a slow breath. She is a leader at the Veteran Transition Center, an advocate for change, and someone who reminds us that kindness isn't just a choice, it's what makes us truly human. The applause started before she even stepped onto the stage. Danielle swallowed her nerves, took one last steadying breath, and walked forward. As she reached the podium, the lights illuminated a sea of faces: veterans, business owners, government officials, community members. She spotted William in the front row, sitting beside Colonel Carter, his expression one of unwavering support. Danielle gripped the edges of the podium. And then she spoke. "1 year ago I was fired." The room fell completely silent. "I was fired for standing up for a veteran, for buying him a meal when no one else would, for treating him with dignity when others treated him like he was invisible." She let her words hang for a moment, the weight of the memory pressing down. "I remember walking out of that diner with no job, no security, and no idea what I was going to do next. But I didn't regret it, not for 1 second." She exhaled slowly, looking across the audience. "I thought that moment had cost me everything, but what I didn't realize, what I couldn't have known, was that it gave me so much more." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Danielle's grip on the podium tightened slightly, but this time it wasn't out of fear. "I stand before you today because someone gave me a chance when I needed it the most, and now I have the honor of doing the same for others." She glanced at William, and his small, knowing smile gave her the strength to keep going. "I've learned something over the past year. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. Sometimes it costs you. Sometimes it means standing alone, but it is always, always worth it." Danielle paused, scanning the faces in front of her. "For those of you in this room who have served, I want to say something that you might not hear enough. We see you. We appreciate you, and you are not alone." A few heads nodded. Some people blinked rapidly, swallowing thickly. Danielle let out a small breath, then smiled. "This isn't just about getting veterans jobs. It's about restoring their sense of purpose, their dignity, and their belief that they still matter. Because they do." A swell of applause began to build, moving through the room like a wave. Danielle nodded firmly. "And I promise you this, I will never stop fighting for the people who fought for us." The applause erupted, echoing through the hall. Danielle stepped back from the podium, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. After the speech, Danielle barely had time to process everything before a line of people began forming to shake her hand. She spoke with business leaders, veterans who had just enrolled in the transition program, and even a few government officials who wanted to discuss expanding the center's reach. But one moment stood out above all. A young woman, probably no older than 19 or 20, stepped forward, hesitating slightly. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, her jacket slightly too big for her small frame. Danielle noticed the Marine emblem stitched onto the shoulder. "Ma'am," the young woman said quietly, "can I talk to you for a second?" Danielle smiled warmly. "Of course." The woman took a shaky breath. "I just wanted to say thank you." Danielle blinked. "For what?" The woman's voice was barely above a whisper. "For seeing us," she said, "for seeing me." Danielle's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay steady. "You're not invisible," she said firmly. "You never were." The woman nodded quickly, eyes shimmering, before giving a small salute and walking away. Danielle watched her go, her chest tightening with emotion. William appeared beside her. "See," he said, "told you you'd be good at this." Danielle laughed softly, shaking her head. "I think you're the one who told me that." William grinned. "Well, looks like I was right." Danielle let out a slow breath, taking in everything around her, the laughter, the conversations, the hope in people's eyes. For so long, she had thought getting fired had ruined her life. Now she knew the truth. It had saved her, and it had led her right here, right where she was always meant to be. As the sun began to set over the city, Danielle Walker stepped outside the Veteran Transition Center, inhaling the crisp evening air. The day had been long, filled with conversations, handshakes, and promises of a better future for the men and women who had served. But for her, this wasn't just another day. It was proof that she had chosen the right path. A year ago, she had walked away from Tony's diner, not knowing what would come next. She had lost her job, her security, and, for a brief moment, her faith in people. But today she had stood in front of hundreds of veterans, employers, and community leaders, not as a waitress, not as someone struggling to make ends meet, but as a leader, as a voice that mattered. She had once believed that standing up for the right thing meant losing everything. Now, she understood that it had given her more than she ever could have imagined. The door behind her opened, and Colonel Carter stepped out, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "You did good today, Walker," he said, nodding toward the now empty event hall. Danielle smiled. "I think we all did." The colonel studied her for a moment before smirking. "You ever think about taking a bigger role here? Maybe something permanent?" Danielle chuckled, shaking her head. "Isn't that what I've already been doing?" Carter let out a rare laugh. "Fair enough." William joined them a second later, his hands in his pockets, his expression lighter than she had ever seen before. "Not bad for someone who didn't even know what she was signing up for, huh?" he teased. Danielle nudged him playfully. "Not bad for someone who almost didn't walk into that diner." William chuckled. "Guess we both got lucky." But Danielle knew better. It wasn't luck. It was the power of doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when no one was watching. It was proof that kindness could change lives, not just for the person receiving it, but for the person giving it too. She looked out toward the horizon, the city lights twinkling in the distance. There had been a time when she thought her entire life had fallen apart. Now she knew the truth. It had been falling into place all along. And this was just the beginning.